Please watch the video until the end to feel the full arc of the story and the quiet moment that brings everything together. Chapter 1. The Harbor That Kept Time. He had always believed harbors kept secrets in the deep places where light forgot to go. From his favorite table at the cafe that looked out over the water, the narrator, an old friend to the city and a keen observer of lives that brushed the docks, had watched one of those secrets slowly unravel. Daniel Mercer lived in a small, weathered house on the incline above the port, where gulls stitched the mornings and rain had worn the paint to a soft, honest gray. There was a photograph on his mantel, a woman smiling at the edge of summer, a younger Daniel with an arm slung around her shoulders. Theirs had been a life of ordinary, loving complicities until one day a silence replaced the ordinary. That silence rearranged the town of Daniel's days. Mornings were caution, evenings were ritual, and nights were long enough to invent new shapes for grief. Olive, his daughter, was 7 and had learned, too soon, to measure the cadence of her father's sorrow. She was the bright, stubborn hinge on which the house turned. One sleepless night, mischievous, defiant, and full of the particular wisdom children hold, she dialed a late-night radio program that welcomed callers to speak to an often invisible world. She wanted to tell someone that her father talked to the photograph. She wanted, maybe, to know whether talking out loud would soften the edges of the silence. The radio host, a man with a voice like warm street lamps, let the call run, and the harbor of their lives spilled, unintentionally, through the airwaves. Chapter 2. The Listener in the East. Across the country, in a town of red brick and maples, Evelyn Hart baked her way into the mornings, kneading bread, folding pastries, keeping precise time with a watch that made a soft, comforting ticking. She had an engagement ring tucked into the corner of a drawer and a calendar mapped with plans that looked like the life everyone expected of her. The radio had been playing that night because the cafe across the street kept it on low, and she had paused, flour-dusted hands on the counter, when Olive's small voice said, "My daddy talks to pictures." There was a sharp, unexpected ache in Evelyn's chest. Not for what she had, but for what she recognized. She had loved once with a bravery that matched the way she shaped dough. Gentle pressure, patient waiting. The loss had taught her about the residue of absence, the faint impressions left on places people had touched. Evelyn listened to the rest of the broadcast, to Daniel's halting words that left more unsaid than said. She wrote a letter that afternoon, not to send immediately, but the kind of letter that folded around sorrow like a map. She was engaged, and yet the letter was honest, unadvertised to anyone but the paper and the pen. In it she confessed her own history of quiet evenings, her own habit of lighting a candle for the people she missed. When she did finally post it, an impulsive act inspired by something like faith, it was because she believed foolishly and wonderfully that hearts can find each other across signals and miles. Chapter 3. Letters that crossed maps. What started as a single letter became a handful of exchanges. The radio station read Evelyn's note aloud during a follow-up show, and someone made a copy and sent it. There was no grand orchestration, only the small, relentless mechanics of human curiosity. Daniel received the first of the letters wrapped in a plain envelope, the handwriting careful and uneven, like someone who had to teach the world to trust again. He wrote back with the idiom of someone who wore grief like a coat, practical, honest, a little shy. Olive insisted on answering every postcard as if they were secret treasures. The narrator watched the two adults learning the slow rules of acquaintance. How to let silences fall without filling them. How to ask questions that mattered. How to offer stories that did not demand immediate repair, but only a shared remembering. For Evelyn, writing became a kind of rehearsal for feeling alive in a new arrangement. For Daniel, it was a small sun that rose and made the house less cold. Their correspondence was not always sweet. Sometimes it cracked with fear. Sometimes it sat quietly with no pressure to become something it wasn't yet. But something like hope threaded through their sentences, lightening dull afternoons, making evenings worth attending. Chapter 4. The Decision to Cross. Evelyn had a fiancé, a mankind in practical ways, but steady as a road. She found herself standing at a crossroads she hadn't mapped. The letters no longer felt like whispers from strangers. They were the accumulating evidence of a companionship that grew in small, stubborn increments. On a wet morning, after a shift spent glazing tarts and watching steam lift from cups, she made a choice that surprised even her. She would go west. The narrator, whose vantage point included trains and ferries and the small logistics of meetings, remembered the day she boarded. He had seen many arrivals of the harbor, couples clasping hands, travelers carrying too much optimism in large suitcases. But Evelyn arrived with an honest, trembling courage that was its own luggage. Daniel read her travel plans in the exact way a person reads a weather forecast, careful, then a little hopeful. He did not plan a theatrically romantic meeting. He thought only to be himself, to walk to the place where the sea and the skyline negotiated their boundaries. Olive made him promise something private. No grand speeches without running it by her first. Chapter 5. The Night of Lanterns. Storms came the evening Evelyn reached the city. Wide sheets of rain that made the harbor reflect lights like an audience of small, attentive stars. Plans dissolved into the glow of wet pavement. The narrator watched from the cafe as two people, summoned by letters and a desire to honor the fragile promise between them, circled each other like tides. There was a moment, sharp and absurd, when neither of them recognized the other immediately. The city had rearranged their faces with umbrellas and hurried collars. Evelyn stood beneath a bridge, her hair flattened, a scrap of paper with a station name folded in one hand. Daniel approached from the other side, Olive at his side, carrying a paper lantern like a small comet. The crowd around them carried its own stories. People waiting for trains, lovers parting, a musician tuning a guitar. When they finally saw each other, it was not a scene from a film, but an ordinary, miraculous collision. Two people who had been brave enough to send letters into the dark, and then braver still to step into the rain. They talked as if testing waters. Small questions, warmer recollections, a few jokes that landed like pebbles in the harbor. The narrator, who had watched the city teach its lessons of patience and chance, felt the sort of satisfaction that comes when a plan that sounded like a fantasy resolves into a simple truth. They liked being together. Chapter 6. The harbor keeps soft promises. No thunderclap, no cinematic flourish came afterward. Only a sequence of small, honest moments that stitch two lives to the same seam. Evelyn's fiancé returned from a business trip to a conversation neither of them tried to dramatize. She listened, and he understood in the way good people sometimes do. They parted with gratitude rather than anger, admitting that sometimes the shape of a life changes without bitterness, simply because it must. Daniel and Evelyn navigated the natural, awkward intimacy of learning one another's rhythms. Olive's bedtime rituals, Daniel's habit of leaving the kettle on low, Evelyn's Sunday sweet buns that came like a promise of patience and reward. The narrator observed the city around them, how its fog made privacy of a peculiar sort, how its constant light, rain, seemed a kind custodian for new beginnings. Months passed, and letters dwindled into less frequent notes. No longer the lifeline of strangers, but the affectionate shorthand of companions. They still wrote sometimes, casually. They still sent postcards when they traveled. What had begun as a radio call from a small, brave child became something both grounding and wild. A family remade, not by theatrical destiny, but by the quiet accumulation of ordinary choices. The narrator liked to tell people that love, in its finest hour, is not always a sudden revelation. Sometimes it is a patient architecture, small bricks of daily kindness, mutual respect, and the occasional daring to speak aloud the truth of one's loneliness. Daniel and Evelyn found each other in a city that kept secrets in its harbor, and their story proved that even the loneliest nights have the potential to be interrupted by the warmth of a return voice. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, give the video a like, comment below with your favorite moment, and share the video with someone who loves a gentle romantic story.